Along the western coast, where the sea breathed in slow, heavy sighs and the gulls cried as if they carried old news, there lay a village unlike any other. People called it the Village of Two Suns, though no one could agree on why. Some said it was because the sunsets lasted twice as long here as anywhere else, spilling molten gold across the water until night itself grew weary of waiting. Others whispered that there was more than one sun in the sky, the second hidden, watching, judging. Whatever the reason, the days were long and bright, the crops grew rich and sweet, and fishermen claimed their nets caught more than just fish when the light was right. But the light was not a gift freely given. Every blessing in the Village of Two Suns came bound with a shadow, and the villagers knew it. At the edge of every celebration, behind every feast, there lurked the whisper of the curse that had clung to the place for generations. The elders did not speak of it plainly, but in the pauses between their words, in the sideways glances they cast at the great stone brazier in the central square, the truth simmered. The brazier was never allowed to go cold. Its flames were said to be the heart of the village, lit by the sun itself in the days before memory, when men and spirits still bargained face to face. It was those flames that decided the worth of a bride. The tradition was called the fire's judgment. On the day of a wedding, as the vows were spoken, the sacred torch was lit from the brazier and passed from hand to hand, until it reached the bride. She was to hold it before the gathered people, letting its light rest upon her face. If she was pure of heart and honest of spirit, the flame would burn steady and warm. But if she carried deception or malice, the fire would betray her, flaring wild or even leaping from the torch to consume her wedding veil. At least, that was the story the children told, daring one another to creep near the brazier after dark. Most of the time the flame behaved as it should. But the few times it had turned against a bride were remembered in chilling detail, passed from mouth to mouth until they became warnings as much as memories. And in the weeks before the wedding of Calin, the fisherman's son, the air was thick with a tension that clung even under the endless sunlight. His bride-to-be Aisha was a stranger to these shores, a woman carried in by the sea years ago, clinging to a broken plank from a wreck no one claimed to have seen. She had lived among them long enough to become one of their own, or so it seemed. The older women admired her grace, the children loved her stories, and Calin loved her with a quiet certainty that made him deaf to any doubts. But not everyone was deaf. There was another who had dreamed of standing beside Calin under that endless sunset. Zara, who had known him since childhood, who had fished beside him and worked beside him, who understood the tides of this place as well as she understood her own heartbeat. She watched as Aisha's wedding day drew near, and something in her gaze sharpened. The village would say later that the fire's judgment was meant for the bride alone. But fire, like the sea, chooses its own path. And in the Village of Two Suns, where blessings walked arm in arm with curses, there are nights when flames lean toward truths no one dares to speak. On one such night, the brazier's heart would leap higher than ever before, not to destroy the bride, but to reveal the enemy she never knew she had. The first time the villagers saw Aisha, she was barely more than a shadow tangled in seaweed, her pale wedding dress, for she had been wearing one even then, torn to ribbons by the waves. It was Calin's father who spotted her, a limp figure drifting in on the morning tide, and it was Calin himself, still a boy, who waded waist-deep into the foaming surf to drag her to shore. She coughed up seawater and sand, opened her eyes to the blazing light of the Village of Two Suns, and whispered something in a language no one recognized before fainting in his arms. The elders debated her fate as they always did with strangers. But Calin's mother wrapped her in a blanket and sat her by the brazier's warmth, and Calin refused to leave her side. By the time she could walk again, it was decided she would stay with them for a while, until her own people came to claim her. They never did. Years passed, and Aisha grew into herself like a tree taking root in strange soil. Her skin carried a faint shimmer when wet, and her eyes held the shifting colors of the sea, gray in storms, blue when she laughed, green when she was still. She worked alongside Calin's mother, mending nets, gutting fish, and gathering herbs along the rocky shore. It seemed that water obeyed her in ways it did not others. Fish swam closer when she stood at the docks, rain seemed to follow her steps in dry spells, and she could always find the sweetest springs inland. To most in the village she became a cherished part of their lives. The fishermen said she brought them luck. The children, fascinated by her otherworldly air, trailed after her like ducklings. Old women swore their ailments eased when she brought them tea brewed with herbs only she could find. Even the sun seemed gentler when it touched her. But for Zara, none of these charms were blessings. Zara had known Calin since they were both toddlers tumbling in the shallows. Their families had worked the same stretch of coast for generations, and the village, without saying it aloud, had always imagined the two would marry one day. She was strong, quick with her hands, and bold enough to stand her ground in any argument. Kaelin trusted her with everything, until Aisha came. At first, Zara tried to ignore the slow shifting of his attention, telling herself it was pity that made him watch Aisha so closely, admiration that made him smile when she spoke. But pity turned to care and care to love, until Zara found herself on the outside of a story she thought had already been written. The tension between the two women was almost invisible at first. A glance too long, a pause too heavy. Zara would volunteer to help with the nets, only to find Aisha already there, her fingers weaving deftly. Aisha would come to fetch water from the well and find Zara leaning against it, arms crossed, offering curt replies. Then the whispers began. It started with the old tale spinners who sat by the brazier in the evenings. They remembered stories of sea wives, women who came from the ocean taking the form of mortals until they could lure men back beneath the waves. The elders didn't say outright that Aisha was one of them, but they didn't have to. Their words drifted like smoke, curling into the minds of anyone willing to listen. She was wearing a wedding dress when they found her, one woman murmured over her mending. Who was she marrying before? Or burying? Salt water runs through her veins, another said. Salt water keeps secrets. Zara never claimed to start these rumors. She simply let them grow, feeding them here and there with a well-placed question, a carefully timed silence. She knew how the village worked, how the warmth of community could turn cold as the tide when fear took hold. And fear once born is a hungry thing. By the time the date for the fire's judgment was set, the undercurrent was impossible to miss. People smiled at Aisha in the market, but their eyes lingered just a little too long. Children still played with her, but their mothers called them home sooner. A fisherman's wife poured her tea but didn't drink from the same pot. Aisha noticed. Of course she noticed. Her smile still came easily, her laughter still rang like bells over water, but she had begun to pause at the edge of the shore, gazing at the horizon as if she could hear something calling her name. In the village of two suns, light lasted longer than it should. But shadows too lingered past their time, and they were starting to gather, not in the open where they could be burned away, but in the quiet spaces between people. And in the center of it all stood Zara, watching the bride from the sea with a gaze like a knife held just out of sight. Zara had always known about the fire's judgment. Every villager did. It was one of the oldest traditions in the village of two suns, a ceremony held the night before the wedding, when the sun dipped into the horizon but its light clung stubbornly to the waves. Guests would gather in a great circle around the couple, passing a torch lit from the village's eternal brazier. As each person held it, they would speak a blessing for the bride and groom, the flame carrying the warmth of their goodwill to the union. It was said that the fire never lied, that if a bride was unworthy, the torch would flicker strangely, smoke curling in warning. But there was another version of the story, one rarely spoken aloud. In the old days when the village was more ruthless, a steady flame could be coaxed to turn against someone if it was guided. A certain herb burned with it could twist its heat, turning blessing into curse. The thought had always been a scrap of old gossip to Zara, nothing to waste breath on, until the day she met the stranger. It was a humid afternoon in the market. Zara had gone to trade a basket of dried squid for a bolt of dyed cloth. That's when she noticed him, a man standing in the shade between two stalls, his eyes like embers banked under ash. He was no fisherman, no farmer. His robe was travel-worn, the fabric stitched with patterns she didn't recognize, and his smile was the sort you felt before you saw it. "You're the one they say will be the bride's witness," he said as she passed. She stopped, frowning. "And who says that?" "Everyone says something. But I listen for what they don't say." He tilted his head. "They don't say you're happy about it." Zara didn't answer. She didn't need to, something in her eyes must have been enough because the man's smile widened. "The fire's judgment," he said softly, "is more than it appears. It can bless. It can also reveal." She narrowed her gaze. "Reveal what?" "Whatever truth is waiting to burn through," he replied as if the words themselves were a kind of bargain. Then, almost lazily, he drew a small pouch from his robe and let her glimpse the contents, brittle blackened leaves that released a sharp, resinous scent. "A touch of this in the right moment and the flame will show everyone who she really is. If she's pure, she'll survive. If not..." He let the words drift away like smoke in a breeze. When Zara blinked, he was already turning, vanishing into the crowd. She told herself it was just a coincidence, that she wouldn't use it. But her fingers itched for the pouch. In the days that followed, the village bustled with preparations for the wedding, and Zara's small acts of sabotage began. Nothing grand, nothing that could be traced back to her. A spool of thread meant for Aisha's gown fell into the fire. A basket of carefully gathered flowers for the bridal arch was mysteriously crushed beneath an overturned barrel. A ribbon for the groom's tunic was sliced neatly in two and hidden in the reeds by the shore. People whispered that the wedding was cursed, that Aisha had brought the sea's bad luck with her. Zara kept her face smooth, offering to help mend and replace the things that had been ruined. Each time, she let her gaze rest on Aisha for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, as though silently confirming that the village's suspicions were justified. But beneath those small cruelties was the real plan, the one that twisted in Zara's chest like a living thing. On the night of the fire's judgment, she would hold the torch in her hands, add a pinch of the stranger's leaves, and watch the flames turn against the bride. She imagined the gasps, the way people would recoil from Aisha, the way Kaylin's eyes would finally open to the truth Zara had always known, that this woman did not belong here. She told herself it was justice. She told herself it was the will of the fire. But in the quiet of her own mind, Zara could hear something else entirely, the slow, steady rhythm of envy, beating like a drum toward the moment she would finally see the sea girl burn. The day before the wedding dawned with a heavy, breathless heat. The sun lingered unnaturally as it always did in the village of two suns, but its warmth felt different, thick, pressing down on skin and bone, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Aisha stood at the edge of the tide, skirts damp, watching the horizon where the line between sea and sky blurred in a silver haze. She had risen early to clear her mind, but unease clung to her like wet linen. No one had said anything outright, yet there was a shift in the way people looked at her, a tautness in their voices. The laughter of the women mending decorations stopped when she passed. Children who once splashed at her ankles now stared from a safe distance, their mothers calling them away. It was as if something had been whispered in every ear but hers. Kaylin, her groom, had been busy all day with preparations, but when she caught glimpses of him across the square, there had been something clouded in his expression. He smiled still, Kaylin always smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. She told herself it was just nerves. She told herself many things. Yet the unease remained, curling in her stomach like a trapped eel. That evening, as the sun began its slow, lingering descent, Zara made her way to Kaylin's home. She wore a shawl the color of embers and carried a basket of spiced bread, a gesture that seemed warm and harmless to any onlooker. Kaylin greeted her at the door with surprise but welcomed her in, grateful for a moment away from the endless bustle. "I came to see how you were holding up," she said, her tone honeyed with concern. "Weddings can be overwhelming." Kaylin laughed softly. "You're telling me? I feel like I haven't had a quiet moment in weeks." Zara placed the basket on the table, leaning in slightly. "That's what I thought. And in the middle of all this, well, I just wanted to be sure you're certain about Aisha." The laughter in his eyes dimmed. "Certain? Of course I am." Zara sighed, looking away as if reluctant to speak further. "It's just, she came from the sea and none of us know what her life was before. I'm sure she's told you what she remembers after the shipwreck. But memory can be tricky. And the sea keeps secrets better than any of us." Kaylin's jaw tightened. "Aisha's past doesn't matter to me." "I know," Zara said quickly, a faint smile on her lips. "That's what makes you so good. But others may not be so forgiving if certain truths came out." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The seed was planted. When she left, Kaylin stood in the doorway watching her go, her words lingering like a thorn beneath the skin. That night, as darkness slowly seeped into the village despite the sun's stubborn glow, the wind shifted. Out at sea, black clouds gathered like a fleet of silent ships, their bellies heavy with storm. Lightning flickered far away, illuminating the rolling waves in ghostly silver. The fishermen muttered that such a storm on such a night was an omen. The village moved faster, tightening ropes on boats, securing loose shutters. In the ceremonial hall, elders checked the eternal brazier, feeding it oil from carved clay jars. The brazier's flame was the source of all ritual fires, and tomorrow, it would light the torch for the fire's judgment. No one noticed the shadow that slipped in through the side door. It moved with practiced quiet, careful to keep to the corners where the firelight did not reach. The shadow paused by the row of clay jars, fingers brushing over each until it found the one marked for the wedding torch. With a swift motion, the cork was removed and a pinch of brittle black leaves was dropped in, their scent sharp and foreign. The shadow swirled them into the oil with a sliver of wood, ensuring they dissolved enough to go unnoticed. When the cork was replaced, the jar was set exactly as it had been, its surface still warm from the hall's heat. The shadow hesitated for just a moment, head tilting toward the flickering brazier, as though listening for some kind of approval. Then it melted back into the night, unseen. Outside, the wind rose to a mournful howl, rattling shutters and bending the palms along the shore. Aisha, lying awake in her small room, could hear the storm building like a living thing beyond the horizon. She felt again that strange, twisting unease, but still she could not name it. She only knew that tomorrow she would stand before her village with a torch in her hands, and the fire would speak. And somewhere in the dark, someone had already decided what it should say. The wedding day arrived wrapped in gold. The village of two suns lay bathed in its eternal sunset, every rooftop, palm frond, and face glowing as though dipped in molten amber. The sea was calm now, the storm from the night before broken and spent, but a strange heaviness lingered in the air, like the hush before a secret is spoken aloud. The great open courtyard had been transformed into a festival of color and sound. Strings of red and gold ribbons fluttered between carved poles, drums throbbed like a heartbeat, and the smell of roasting fish and sweet-spiced bread mingled with the salt air. At the center stood the sacred brazier, its fire dancing within a blackened stone basin said to have burned without end for centuries. It was from this eternal flame that the fire's judgment would be lit, a tradition older than any wedding song. Aisha stood beside Kaelin before the elders, her gown of ivory linen catching the long light. Shells from the shore wove through her dark hair, their pearly sheen glimmering. The warmth of the crowd pressed in around her, yet she felt their gaze not as comfort but as scrutiny. Even in the laughter, she could hear the edge of a whisper, the hiss of doubt sliding from lip to lip. Elder Maku, the keeper of the flame, stepped forward. His lined hands dipped the ceremonial torch into the brazier, and the fire curled up around the oiled cloth, its orange tongue alive and hungry. The torch's handle was carved from driftwood so old it was said to remember every hand it had passed through. Maku's voice carried across the courtyard. This is the fire's judgment. It will pass through all gathered here, blessing the bride if she is worthy in the eyes of truth. The first hands took the torch, faces solemn as the heat licked upward. One by one the villagers accepted it, holding it close for a breath before passing it on. The flame burned steady, but in the air above it, the heat shimmered like something restless. Zara stood among the women near the front, her eyes never leaving Aisha. She smiled faintly, though her fingers twisted in the folds of her crimson shawl. Every time the torch changed hands, she seemed to lean forward slightly, watching how the fire moved, patient as a spider waiting for the tremor of its web. Aisha tried to still the tremble in her chest. The torch moved closer with each exchange, the murmurs of the crowd swelling, breaking into laughter in places, falling back into silence in others. She could feel it coming for her, the moment the fire would test her before every watching eye. The torch passed to a fisherman whose gaze darted toward Zara, just for an instant before he stepped forward. He held the torch out to Aisha, and as her fingers closed around the warm wood, she felt the weight of it, heavier than she expected, as though it knew her name. The flame bent toward her, not away, a sudden rush of heat against her face. It flared without warning, a brilliant surge of gold and white, leaping high enough to make the nearest villagers gasp and step back. The ribbons strung above snapped in the sudden heat, curling at the edges. Aisha's breath caught, the light blinding, and for a moment she thought she heard something, not the roar of fire but a low resonant note, like the sea humming in her bones. The heat pressed close, almost embracing her, but it did not burn. It was as if the flame were looking at her. Whispers tore through the crowd. It leaps for her. Others muttered darker things, or it leaps to consume. Zara's eyes narrowed, her smile frozen in place. This was not the way she had imagined it. She had expected the flame to shrink, to falter, to reveal something shameful. Instead, it raged alive in Aisha's hands, casting long shadows that seemed to point, accusing, in every direction but hers. Elder Maku's voice cut through the murmurs, steady but tinged with something like awe. The fire has spoken. It knows its enemy. And in that moment, as the flame settled but still burned brighter than before, a ripple passed through the crowd, the sense that the judgment had not ended but only begun. The torch should have licked at Aisha's veil, curling the edges, marking her as unworthy in the eyes of the village. That was what Zara had been promised. That was what she had waited for. But instead, the flame in Aisha's hand surged upward like a living thing, then bent sharply as if turning its head. Gasps broke out as the fire leapt away from the torch altogether, a sudden arc of light that seared through the air and struck Zara full in the chest. For a heartbeat, the courtyard froze. Zara's crimson shawl blazed instantly, the flames racing along the fabric with frightening speed. She staggered back, swatting at the fire with wide, disbelieving eyes. But there was no pain, no burning of flesh. The heat kissed her skin without injury, devouring only the cloth. Her shawl disintegrated in a whirl of glowing threads, drifting upward like dying fireflies. The crowd murmured in disbelief, some shouting for water, others crossing themselves and warding signs. Aisha still held the torch, its flame steady now, as though it had given part of itself to carry out its will. The brazier behind Elder Maku answered with a sudden roar, flames leaping higher than the elders themselves. Sparks spat into the sky, carried on the wind toward the dark remnants of last night's storm. Overhead, the clouds seemed to shudder, a low roll of thunder sounding though no lightning struck. Zara's breathing grew ragged. Her eyes darted from Aisha to the brazier, then to the elders who were now pressing forward. The smell of charred fabric filled the air, mingling with salt and smoke. Her once pristine gown now hung in ragged blackened strips, the bright dyes eaten away. She was bare to the judgment of every watching face, and for the first time in years she looked small. The flame has chosen. Elder Maku's voice cracked like a whip, carried over the murmurs. His eyes were fixed on Zara, heavy with something between pity and condemnation. It knows deceit when it stands before it. No. Zara's voice was hoarse, her hands trembling. She's the one. She brought the curse from the sea. She pointed at Aisha, desperation twisting her face. You all know it. The brazier boomed again, a sound so deep it rattled the wooden beams of the courtyard. Another shower of sparks shot upward, the embers whirling together like a flock of golden birds before scattering into the wind. The villagers fell silent, every gaze locked on the woman who stood in tatters, her voice faltering under the weight of the fire's verdict. Aisha's heart pounded, but she did not speak. She did not need to. The heat still shimmered faintly in the air between her and Zara, a trembling wall of light only she seemed to feel. Elder Maku stepped closer to Zara, his expression hardening. The fire's judgment has not aired in centuries. It reveals what words conceal. And today it has shown us that the poison lies not in the bride's heart. His gaze flicked to the torn gown, then to the small pouch at Zara's hip. Bring it here. Two younger villagers moved in, seizing her arms before she could retreat. They pulled the pouch free, spilling its contents onto the stone. A small vial of oil rolled forward, catching the sunlight, the same kind used to feed the sacred flames, now tainted with the scent of foreign resin. A collective murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. Zara's eyes filled with fury and fear. You don't understand. You were guiding the flame, Maku said, cutting her off. But fire belongs to no hand. It knows its own will. The wind rose suddenly, tossing Aisha's veil back and sending the last scraps of Zara's burned shawl spinning into the sea air. Overhead, the clouds seemed to peel apart, a shaft of deep orange light striking the brazier, making it blaze brighter still. Some in the crowd stepped back from Zara, others stared openly, their faces unreadable. A child's voice broke the hush. She tried to burn the bride. It was a simple sentence, but it spread like a spark to dry grass. Within moments, the words were on every tongue, not shouted but murmured, a truth taking root in the collective mind. Zara's shoulders sagged. The defiance in her eyes flickered like the dying edge of a candle. She looked once at Kalen, the man she had thought would be hers, but he did not meet her gaze. His attention was on Aisha, his expression grim but certain. The fire has judged, Elder Maku repeated, his voice steady as stone. Let us not question what is older than our own names. The flames in the brazier settled then, still high but no longer raging. The torch in Aisha's hand felt lighter, its heat soft and steady. The ceremony was not yet over, but something far deeper had already been decided. Above, the wind carried the last sparks out toward the open sea, as if delivering the village's secret to the horizon. And somewhere in that long, strange sunset, it felt as though the fire was still watching, not done with its judgment, only waiting for the next truth to burn into the open. Zara didn't wait for the ceremony to end. The murmurs were knives in her skin, the eyes of the crowd too sharp to bear. She pushed past the villagers, ignoring the hands that reached to stop her. The long courtyard gave way to the winding alleys between clay-walled homes, and she vanished into them, her tattered gown trailing threads like embers in her wake. But her retreat didn't quiet the unrest. The courtyard buzzed with voices rising over one another, questions, demands, disbelief. Why would she do it? Who told her the flame could be guided? What curse was she speaking of? The elders exchanged grim looks, for this was not a day to leave questions unanswered. By the time Kalin and Elder Maku sent a group to follow Zara, she was already gone from sight, the trail cold. What lingered instead were scraps of memory from the days before the wedding, and one in particular stood out. "The man in the red scarf," murmured Banu, the oldest fisherman in the village. "I saw her speaking with him in the market." At this, a ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. The stranger had arrived only 2 weeks ago, with wares no one had seen before: bronze amulets etched with curling flames, tiny jars of blackened resin, knives with handles carved like tongues of fire. He had vanished just as quickly, slipping away the morning before the wedding. When some of the younger men returned from searching the shoreline, they brought news. The stranger's stall in the marketplace was abandoned, its goods gone, save for one thing: a folded scrap of parchment left beneath a flat river stone. It was not addressed to anyone, yet the elders read it as if it were meant for their eyes alone. It spoke of a debt left unpaid, of a promise made to the flames beneath the waves, and of a family who had turned their back on that promise generations ago. The last line was a warning: the pact will not forgive. If the heirs will not pay, the fire will claim its due. That night, Aisha lay awake in the room set aside for her and Kalin, the sounds of the surf outside rising and falling like a heartbeat. The words from the parchment would not leave her mind. She had always known the fire's judgment as a tradition, a story told to make weddings feel grand and mysterious. But there was something older under it, something the elders had never spoken aloud. Unable to sleep, she went to Elder Maku's home. The old man, already awake, seemed unsurprised by her visit. He sat her before the embers of his hearth and began to speak. "It is not superstition," he said quietly. "The fire's judgment began long before there was a village. Our founders came from 2 places, the mountains and the sea. They settled here where the river meets the ocean, and they could not agree how to keep the land safe. So they called upon the oldest forces they knew, flame and tide. An offering was made, a pact struck. Fire would guard us from deceit and betrayal, water from famine and drought. In return, we were to keep the balance between them." His gaze was heavy as he added, "The balance was broken long ago. And it was Zara's family who broke it." Aisha felt the truth press against her like heat. Her great-grandfather, Maku went on, was one of the firekeepers, a chosen few tasked with tending the sacred brazier and carrying its flame during the judgment. But he sought to bind the fire's will to his own, to control its choice of who was worthy. He failed. The fire turned on him. In shame, his line withdrew from the ceremony, claiming they no longer believed in it. But the pact remembers and the debt remains. It was no wonder, Aisha thought, that Zara had been so quick to believe she could guide the flame. It was in her family's legacy, twisted by pride and old bitterness. And it was no wonder that the stranger in the market had known exactly whom to whisper to, the one whose blood already carried the echo of that defiance. When she left Maku's home, the night air smelled faintly of smoke despite no fires burning in the streets. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the sea whispered against the shore, its rhythm calm, almost expectant. The next morning, the village woke to find that the brazier's flame, which should have burned low after the wedding, still danced high and bright in the courtyard. Some said it was a sign that the pact was restless again, waiting for something more. Aisha stood before it, watching the way the light bent in the wind. She no longer saw it as a mere symbol. It was alive, watching as much as it was watched. And if the fire truly had memory, then it would not stop at shaming Zara. It would keep searching until the old debt was repaid, in loyalty, in truth, or in ashes. The wind came first, a long low howl that pressed against every shutter and door. Then the rain, heavy as thrown stones, driven sideways by the storm's breath. By the time the elders summoned the village to the great hall, the sky was a churning bruise over the coast, and the sea roared like an angry beast. Zara stood apart from the rest, her hair damp from the rain, her dress still scorched from the ceremony. She had not fled far after all. 2 fishermen had found her huddled under the old jetty, staring at the waves. They'd brought her in without a word. At the center of the hall, the sacred brazier burned brighter than it should have, its flames coiling and darting like serpents. Every time a gust rattled the walls, the fire seemed to lean toward Zara, casting her in flickering light. Some swore they heard the brazier whisper, not words exactly, but the suggestion of voices, insistent and low, as if the flame itself was eager to pass judgment. The elders formed a half-circle before her. Kalin stood among them, his jaw tight. The rest of the villagers packed the hall, wet cloaks dripping onto the reed mats. The air was thick with damp salt and the faint, sharp scent of the brazier's resin. Elder Maku's voice cut through the murmurs. Zara, daughter of the line of Asham, you stand before the fire's judgment once more. The flame spared your skin but burned away your pride. Will you confess to what you sought? Zara lifted her chin, eyes shining not with tears but with defiance. I sought only to protect the village from a bride whose blood we do not know. The sea brought her here, and the sea hides many dangers. The words rippled through the crowd. Aisha felt them like cold water on her back. She stepped forward, the villagers parting for her, her bare feet silent on the mats. Protection, she said softly. Or vengeance for a wedding you thought should have been yours? Zara's gaze faltered for a heartbeat, but her voice stayed steady. What difference does it make? If the flame is truth, let it speak again. It was then the brazier flared, sending shadows racing across the hall's high beams. The shapes on the walls began to move in ways no firelight should, twisting, bending into images. Gasps broke the tense silence as the shadows showed scenes from the past. A man in the same red scarf as the market stranger, speaking with a younger Zara by the old well, Zara's hands tipping a vial into a clay oil jar. The groom's father meeting the stranger under the moonlight, exchanging something wrapped in cloth. The villagers murmured, confusion and anger mixing in equal measure. Zara's face drained of color. No, she whispered, that is not. But the shadows shifted again, showing her great-grandfather defying the firekeepers, attempting to bind the flame to his will. The brazier snapped loudly as if in bitter remembrance. Outside, thunder cracked so loud it seemed the hall's beams might splinter. Aisha turned toward the elders, her voice calm though the wind rattled the walls. I will not ask for her exile. The crowd stirred in disbelief. She wronged me, Aisha continued, but her life is not mine to take. The fire has shown us the truth, but truth is not always the same as justice. Let the pact see that we are not only keepers of flame but of mercy. Maku studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mercy is not weakness, he said. But the pact must be answered. Before any reply could be made, the storm bellowed again, and a lightning bolt struck the sea so close that its light flooded the hall. For a heartbeat, the walls and faces inside were gone, replaced by a vision through the wide-open doors. The black waves lit silver, and in their midst, a broken hull rising and falling. Aisha's breath caught. She knew that shape. The jagged mast, the warped railing, it was the very ship she had clung to years ago, the wreck that had delivered her to this shore. Another flash revealed more, not just driftwood and ruin, but something glowing faintly in the hold. The villagers leaned forward, murmuring in awe and fear. The brazier's flame hissed suddenly, spitting sparks toward the door as if urging them out into the storm. Aisha felt it deep in her chest, the fire calling, the sea answering. Whatever lay in that wreck was part of the pact's unfinished story. And perhaps, the true reason the flame had spared her was not to save her life, but to lead her back to where it began. In that moment, with rain pounding the roof and lightning clawing at the horizon, she knew, the trial was not over. The fire's judgment was only the beginning. The storm had spent itself by morning, leaving the village washed in silver light and the smell of wet earth. The sea lay restless but calmer, its foam tracing long, crooked fingers along the sand. In the great hall, the brazier still burned, but the fire was low, a pale, wavering thing instead of the fierce heart it had been for centuries. The villagers whispered about it in uneasy tones, for the flame of the pact had never faltered, not even in their grandparents' time. Zara stood before the elders once more, her hair tangled and her clothes clinging from the rain. She no longer met anyone's eyes. Her voice when it came was hoarse. It is true, she said. I meant for the fire to fall on Aisha. I thought, if she was burned, the village would see what I had always believed, that she did not belong here. I tore the fabrics, ruined the flowers, mixed the oil. All of it. A hush fell over the hall. Only the faint hiss of the brazier's struggling flame broke the silence. I did not know who the man in the market truly was, she added, her words trembling but urgent. He told me the fire would obey my will. He said nothing of his quarrel with the groom's family or the pact. If I had known. If you had known, Elder Maku interrupted, his tone heavy, would you have stopped? Zara faltered, her gaze dropping to the reed mats. No answer came. Kalen, standing near the elders, closed his eyes briefly. You were my friend, he said quietly. Before this. I was in love with you, she blurted as if it mattered now. And I hated her for taking what I thought was mine. The words seemed to echo in the rafters, ugly and raw. The elders exchanged glances, their decision already written in the lines of their faces. You have broken the trust of this village, Maku said at last. And you have fed deceit into the flame that has guarded us since the days of the founders. The pact is wounded but not yet dead. If you wish to return, you must mend what you have broken. Until then you cannot remain. Gasps and murmurs swept through the hall, though no one truly argued. Exile was not death, but it was no small punishment. Zara's shoulders sank. She bowed her head, then turned without protest toward the great doors, the morning light spilling across her as she stepped outside. When she was gone, Aisha approached the brazier. The fire there seemed to shrink away from her hand, not in rejection but in weariness. Its once golden heart glowed faint red, no higher than a candle's flame. "It has not dimmed like this in any of our lifetimes," said Elder Sahi, her voice tight with worry. "It is telling us the work is not finished." Aisha thought of the shipwreck she had seen in the storm's lightning, the faint light deep within its hull. Something about it pulled at her like the tide, the same way the flame had called to her on the night of the ceremony. She felt in her bones that the two were bound together. Quietly, she reached for a clay lantern resting by the brazier's side. Lifting its lid, she held it over the coals until the smallest ember leapt into it. The flame shivered, then settled, burning steady inside its new vessel. "What are you doing?" Kaelin asked, stepping closer. "Sending a message," Aisha said. "If the pact began with the sea and the fire, perhaps they must speak again." She walked past the elders, out into the bright, damp air. The villagers followed at a distance, curious and wary. Down at the shoreline, the tide hissed and swirled around her ankles as she waded in. She held the lantern high for a moment, letting its light dance on the water, then set it gently on the waves. The current took it at once, carrying it toward the open horizon. The spark inside glowed warm against the vast silver sea, a small, defiant heartbeat against the morning. No one spoke. They watched as the lantern drifted farther, its light shrinking but never going out. And somewhere beyond the reef, a faint answer seemed to shimmer in the water, a promise or perhaps a warning that the pact's reckoning was not yet over. Behind them, in the hall, the brazier's flame gave a single bright flare before settling again, as if it had seen the lantern leave and approved. But it did not grow stronger. Not yet. The long summer had passed, giving way to the gentler winds of autumn. The storms that had once battered the coast now rolled far out at sea, their fury softened before reaching the shore. In the village of Two Suns, people spoke in hushed but grateful tones of the day the fire had turned against deceit, of how both sea and flame had spared them from ruin. Life had resumed its rhythms, though with small but significant changes. The brazier in the great hall was tended daily by Aisha and Kaelin, their hands working together without ceremony. They fed it oil sparingly, speaking to it as though it could hear, for they both believed it could. Some days the flame danced high, others it wavered, but it never again burned with the easy confidence of the years before. It seemed to listen now, as if measuring the honesty of those around it. When the tending was done, Aisha would walk to the shore, her skirts brushing the wet sand. She learned the moods of the waves as one learns the expressions of a friend. The deep, rolling swells that spoke of faraway winds, the restless chop that foretold rain, the glassy stillness that came before moonrise. She felt the sea welcomed her, not as an outsider but as kin, and she welcomed it in return. Zara's name was rarely spoken aloud, but her shadow lingered in conversations. No one knew where she had gone after leaving the village. Some said she had found refuge in a distant port. Others whispered she had taken to the open sea, chasing the stranger who had once fueled her hatred. And sometimes, on moonless nights, a faint lantern's light could be seen far out beyond the reef. It would drift slowly across the horizon before vanishing into the dark. The elders took it as a sign, of warning or promise. No one could agree. Aisha, watching the light, felt only a quiet ache. She bore no wish to see Zara suffer. The fire had already burned away much of her pride, and perhaps the sea was working on the rest. The villagers, once quick to gossip and judge, had grown more cautious with their words. They remembered how whispers had almost fed the flames with the wrong prey. Mothers told their children that jealousy burns the bearer before it ever touches its target, and that truth is the only fuel flames obey. It became a saying etched into the wood of the hall's doors: truth feeds the fire. One clear night, months after the storm and the ceremony, Aisha stood on the bluff where the brazier's glow reached the edge of the shore. The moon was full, casting a wide silver road across the sea. Behind her, the hall's open doors spilled warm gold light, the fire within steady and calm. She stood between them, the two elements that had chosen her, tested her, and, in the end, spared her. The fire hummed softly in the still air, its light catching in her dark hair. The sea murmured below, pulling and returning, pulling and returning. For the first time since she had arrived years ago, Aisha felt no tug between them. Kalen came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. They did not speak. Words seemed too small to name what stood between the glow of the brazier and the moonlit waves, the understanding that peace was not the absence of storms, but the balance after them. And so the bride of two elements watched, the fire warm on her back, the sea's silver breath